We've had fantastic participation here. We have a lot of great questions. I'm going to start off, though, with a question of my own. One of the next anniversaries we're going to be marking this year after VE Day, of course, is the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's not generally realized that the Manhattan Project really could never have succeeded had it not, first of all, been for the leadership of FDR and Churchill, but also for Anglo-American cooperation on the Manhattan Project. I mean, it never would have succeeded without British support. Could you say something about FDR and Churchill and their relation on nuclear weapons research?
Do we have another 45 minutes?
Yeah,
because
a lot to say.
Actually, it's one of the most extraordinary aspects of their friendship, which I didn't even get into because it's so complicated. In the beginning, the British had much more advanced nuclear research than the Americans did. In 1939, Einstein writes a letter to Roosevelt basically saying, the Germans are working on this new atomic bomb, you need to do something, which led directly to the creation of what became the Manhattan Project. The British called their project the tube alloys. They initially worked together and agreed to share research. At a certain point during the war, though, the Americans cut the British out because the British were concerned about post-war nuclear power. And the American military were basically saying, we can't talk about that. We can only talk about military objectives. And Churchill lobbied FDR very, very aggressively to get the British back involved. And in fact, after that Quebec conference, Churchill comes down to FDR's home in Hyde Park and they have a picnic. And during that picnic, they have this extraordinary confrontation where FDR basically says, I will let you British back into the nuclear program if you agree to D-Day and stop wasting time. And although there's no primary documentation for that quid pro quo, both deals were signed on the same day.
Great. So we have a bunch of fantastic questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can, but I'll start with a fairly easy one from Don Ship, who asked, did Churchill ever visit Warm Springs, Georgia during World War II?
Churchill did not visit Warm Springs, but he visited Roosevelt a number of times. They spent 112 days together at various conferences and meetings during the war. He was in Washington, he was in Hyde Park. They spent a lot of time at these conferences together, but I don't think Churchill ever went to Warm Springs. He did go to Mount Vernon, though, with FDR on one of his visits.
Right. Okay. And so John Mosman asks, Prime Minister Churchill indicated that the press of important business in London kept him from attending FDR's funeral. Did he later regret this decision?
That's a great question. And I think it was a very difficult decision for Churchill not to go. But again, you have to remember the circumstances that Churchill was facing at that point. Not only were we right at this critical moment where the Russians were rushing towards Berlin and we were rushing towards Berlin, and there was a sense, of what the post-war world was going to be. Once the Germans surrendered, where your armies were going to define where the boundaries were. Churchill was also facing a very difficult political situation. Just a few months later, by the time of the Potsdam Conference with Truman, Churchill was voted out of office despite his leadership during the war. So he was fighting a political battle at home as well. I also think that the idea of leaving England, traveling to the United States, and coming back at that moment was both politically and militarily challenging, and that's why he didn't do it. But I think in his heart, he really wanted to be there.
Right. I'm sure that's true. James touches on, I think, a really an important issue in terms of friction between FDR and Churchill. And he asks, did Churchill know of FDR's desire to end British and French colonialism?
Oh my God, yes, they knew, and they argued about it constantly. It got to the point where FDR actually stopped having the conversation with Churchill, although Eleanor Roosevelt never gave up. She banged on him every time they got together. But there's a fascinating document in our collection that's on display in the library that most people don't fully understand. It's a list that Churchill drew up when he was at the White House in 1941, when they were trying to come up with this, how they were going to structure the United Nations, the military operation. And Churchill lists the United States, Soviet Union, China, Great Britain, and then under Great Britain or the United Kingdom, he lists Australia, India, New Zealand, Canada, and then all the other countries in the coalition. And you can see FDR has taken a pencil, and next to Australia, he's drawn a line over to the alphabetical listing of countries and put it under A, and he's taken a line after India and put it under I, and taken a line under N and put it under, and he's basically saying, no, these countries are not part of the British Empire. These are independent countries as part of the United Nations. And it sums up their whole relationship.
Right. It's such an important aspect of their relationship. We go back a little bit earlier to an earlier part of your talk. Bill asks for your comments on the Grier Incident in 1941 and Roosevelt's shoot-on-sight order, which really initiated a war in the Atlantic between the United States and Germany before a formal declaration of war.
Well, the U-boat attack on the destroyer Grier and the response to it, first of all, it was probably illegal based on the Neutrality Act and what was in place at that point. But again, FDR was trying to build popular support. There were several attacks on American shippings. Some people think it might have been an accidental attack. The Germans may not have fully realized it was an American destroyer. Hitler was absolutely adamant with the commander of the U-boat force, Admiral Dönitz, that he did not want U-boats attacking American shipping or American military, even though they knew that the Americans were essentially engaged in a secret war here in the North Atlantic. And FDR was trying to use every one of these things as a way to build American anger and commitment towards supporting the British. Of course, in World War I, you had the sinking of Lusitania. There were comparable incidents that had changed American popular opinion. So he very much wanted to do that. But the incidents that were happening along that North Atlantic battleway and how the Germans were attempting to strangle Great Britain without engaging the United States when the two forces became increasingly entwined. But the Grier Incident, again, you could do a whole 45 minutes on that.
There could keep you here for hours, Paul, especially with all the great questions we've got. And, I'm sorry for the leaping back and forth here chronologically, but these are really good questions. Robin asks, why did FDR keep Truman in the dark with regard to the Manhattan Project?
Well, I don't think anybody has a real answer to that. I think the simple answer is that FDR thought he had more time. He knew he was ill, but he thought he was going to recover. He didn't expect to die on April 12th. Yeah. He thought he would have time to bring Truman into the loop. He was only in Washington for about 10 days between the inauguration and his death. He was in Hyde Park, he was in Warm Springs, he was traveling, so he was in Yalta. So he wasn't around very much, and his focus was very much on the United Nations. Now, there's no hard documentation for this other than a passing reference from Daisy Suckley in her diaries. But she pointed out that she thought that FDR was going to step down as president after the war ended to take over the United Nations, and that he wanted someone like Truman to be his partner because he felt that Truman would be an effective partner for him rather than going off on his own. Now, is that true? Who knows? They only met 3 times. The entire file of correspondence between FDR and Truman is only about 4 pages. They had very little contact, and I think it's one of FDR's failures that he did not brief Truman, or at the very least have Truman briefed on the complexity of the situation, because FDR knew he was not a healthy man.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for a couple of more questions, and Herb asks an important question, and I emphasize here the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, and you, Paul, as we've discussed, takes a specific interest in the Holocaust and documenting the Holocaust. We talked about the Morgenthau project that you have and your own work on that, but Herb asks the question you're familiar with: why did the Allies not bomb the railways leading to the concentration camps, which were known at the time? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's several different ways you look at that allocation of military resources. The Allies had been bombing German rail lines since 1941. And when you bomb a rail line, first of all, most of the time you miss. And secondly, they would immediately rebuild the lines, and it would at most delay the use of that line for a very short period of time. The idea that there was precision bombing in World War II is a complete fallacy. About 80% of the bombs dropped did not land within 1 mile. 80% did not land within 1 mile of their target. So the idea that you could fly bombers at 10,000 feet and drop bombs and take out railroad tracks is simply unrealistic from a military point of view. Plus, at that point, there was such an enormous offensive operation going that they were trying to do to divert resources to have a potential temporary damage to rail tracks was a very difficult thing to decide, particularly because how far Auschwitz was, more than 900 miles from the nearest American air base. The bigger question is, why didn't the Russians bomb Auschwitz? But in fact, the only time Auschwitz was actually bombed was by mistake. The Americans were trying to bomb a rubber factory, which was part of the whole complex, which was about 5 miles away. And in that attempt to bomb that factory, several bombs actually fell on the camp, which again goes to the point that the idea of some kind of precision bombing where you could damage parts of the camp and leave other parts open. If you take an 8x10 sheet of paper and you say that that's the entire, Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, and you put a letter A in the lower right-hand corner, that's the relative size of the gas chambers and crematoriums on the camp in terms of the total size of the camp. Even after they got the Auschwitz protocols and understood how the camp was laid out, hitting the crematoriums or the gas chambers would have been essentially impossible.
Okay. Thank you. Again, a very, very difficult question, but an extremely important one. And let's end with this. And it's been a great discussion. We have so many amazing questions here. We could be here for another hour, so maybe we should do a follow-up at some point. But Jeremy asks, we've heard a lot about Churchill's relationship with senior Americans that were in the UK, such as Hopkins, Eisenhower, Stark, and so on, and he used them to send messages to FDR. Were there any Brits in the US who had a similar relationship with FDR that was important?
Well, there were a couple of British ambassadors and senior military officers, but not really. It was a very different circumstance, and in many ways, and I mentioned it, Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister of Canada, was really the closest they had to a member of the ruling United Kingdom political hierarchy that FDR really trusted. There's one exchange between Mackenzie King's diaries are extraordinary. One of the most unappreciated resources in the entire lexicon of World War II material. He kept detailed notes of all of these meetings and everything. And he describes his last meeting with Roosevelt when he's at the White House in Washington. And as Mackenzie King is getting ready to go back to Canada, again, he's the prime minister. Roosevelt basically begs him to stay and says, you're one of my few friends. You're one of the few people that I can truly unburden myself with. So I think if there's one person that acted as a conduit between Churchill and FDR, it was Mackenzie King.
Okay, thank you. And one final question, Tom Too Loud asks, if you've written any books on FDR and Churchill. I don't think you have, but can you recommend any books for those who want to read more about this really important and fascinating relationship?
Well, the John Meacham book, Franklin and Winston, is certainly sort of the most focused book just on their relationship. And he's a great historian, and there's some terrific material in there. I would say that's the book that, if you're going to read one book, you should read. The challenge about FDR and Churchill is that the relationship is complicated on so many levels. Mm-hmm. There's the military friendship, there's the political friendship, there's the sense of what's the post-war world going to be. There's a very different management style. Churchill was extremely emotional. He cried all the time. And he wore his emotions on his sleeve, and he would rage and rant. And FDR was very cool. FDR was very controlled and manipulative at times, but certainly very much a planner. And he would work people against each other, as he did with Stalin and Churchill at the Tehran conference, knowing that he could play those two against each other. which is why Churchill was so emotionally hurt by it, because he felt he'd been betrayed by his friend. And from Roosevelt's point of view, it was really more about accomplishing what he needed to do. So there are so many great books written about them. I think I'll just leave it with the John Meacham book.
Okay, sounds good. Paul Sparrow, director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. Thank you so much. I think it's safe to say this is one of the best presentations we've had.